most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
As a very basic outline of John chapter 5, Jesus performs a miraculous sign. He's accused of breaking the Sabbath because of it. Then he explains what the sign points to, what the people must learn about him and his authority. Now, ideally, we'd walk through the whole chapter in one sitting, but for our purposes here, we'll take one chunk at a time. So let's begin with verse 1 of John chapter 5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. As John continues his narrative, he jumps from the healing of the nobleman's son in Capernaum to this point, skipping over several months of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, as the other three accounts record. John's record focuses on Jesus in Judea and Jerusalem, presenting a few of his signs and extended discourses showing him to be the Word made flesh and the only begotten Son of God. Now, the Feast of the Jews isn't named here as to which feast it was, and Bible students and scholars propose several possibilities, but most favor the Passover, which would be the second Passover of Jesus' ministry. John 6 and verse 4 identifies the third. John 12 verse 1 identifies the beginning of the fourth and final Passover of his ministry. And this timetable supports what most accept as a 3.5-year ministry in total. In any case, at the arrival of the feast, Jesus goes up to Jerusalem. Continuing on in verses 2 through 4, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first, after the stirring of the water, was made well of whatever disease he had. There are several interesting points and difficult questions to consider in these verses, and we surely won't be able to satisfy all of them. But first, it's interesting that John uses the present tense. There is in Jerusalem a pool. Some suggest an early date for John's gospel, before the city of Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. But as McGarvey and others suggest, the pool itself may have remained even after the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. Well, what about the location of the pool? John tells us it was by the sheep gate, or sheep market, as in the King James Version. The words gate and market are being supplied by the translators, but this description indicates the pool was located north of the temple, just beyond the sheep gate, which had been built by the priests in Nehemiah's day, as he records in Nehemiah 3, verse 1. This gate would have been the customary entrance for sheep to be brought in for sacrifice at the temple. Now, John refers to one of 2 adjacent pool areas, an upper and a lower one, distinguished by a shared colonnade. In this model of ancient Jerusalem, you can see what it might have looked like. As you can see, each structure has 4 sides, but one is a shared side with 2 distinct porches, or porticos, one on top of the other. Thus, each pool section can be said to have had 5 porches. Now, portions of the pool appear to have been diverted into smaller areas for washing, as seen in some of the excavated ruins. The Hebrew name Bethesda means house of mercy, kindness, or grace. Now, some manuscripts record the name as Bethzatha or Bethsaida. Whatever the case, my understanding is the waters of this area, possibly fed by a natural spring, had long been used for washing and purification, and were long believed by many to have had medicinal properties of some kind. The Romans ascribed its benefits to their pagan gods of fortune and healing, and may have even built a kind of temple shrine around it. Now, there are waters throughout the world known for providing some healing, but in many cases the belief about them goes well beyond the reality. And this point brings us to the textual issue of verses 3 and 4. The last phrase of verse 3 and all of verse 4 are not found in any New Testament manuscript earlier than the 4th century. Now, I'm far from being a scholar on this issue, but there appears to be a strong case for this bit of text to be an interpolation, meaning it may have been added in later. If so, it probably began as a marginal note from a scribe who was trying to add some explanation, some context to John's narrative, but eventually worked its way into the text itself. And there are a handful of these possible interpolations in the New Testament. Most of them are repeated or at least supported elsewhere in Scripture. This one is more unique. Now, an interpolation isn't necessarily untrue, and whether this is one or not, the question remains of just how to interpret it. Well, verse 3 is straightforward enough. Sick people were waiting for the waters to stir, and evidently the waters did stir or bubble up regularly. The difficulty is with verse 4. Who or what caused the stirring of the waters? Was it really an angel, or was it some natural phenomenon the people believed to be an angel? And what was the actual result of stepping in first? Well, again, it could be argued the text is simply citing what the people believed about the waters, not what was actually happening. If taken as a true and literal description, it would seem those who were lying around and needed healing the most, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed, had the least chance of receiving it because of their disabilities. And this would be, if nothing else, an odd arrangement. But however we understand the text, John is presenting a contrast between what was happening at the pool or not happening at the pool and what Jesus definitely did there. So let's follow Jesus into this pool area, this house of kindness, and see what happens. Verses 5 through 7. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Now, a few things were told and a few things were not told. We're told, by implication, this man was unable to walk. But we're not told exactly how he became that way. We're told he had been in that condition for 38 years, but for how many years he had been lying around the pool isn't said. We're told, again by implication, this man had some friends or someone who carried him to the pool, but not how often they returned to check on him. This man believed his only hope of being healed was to be found in the stirring waters. But invariably, when he tried to get in, dragging himself along, some healthier person, or at least someone who could walk, beat him to it. Now, with this in mind, and knowing Jesus knew all about it, we might find it strange that Jesus asks him if he wants to get well. But what would seem to be obvious isn't always the case. And we often find Jesus asking such questions to stir up hope and faith in the afflicted person. He wanted to hear it from the man's own mouth. And the man replies, in essence, "Yes, I do, but it's no use." Verses 8 and 9. Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. This is now only the third miraculous sign of Jesus described by John in his gospel record. And just like the others, the result is immediate. A man lame for 38 years, his bones and muscle tissues withered, suddenly receives the substance and strength to get up. He walks away from the pool of Bethesda a new man, carrying the bed he used to lie on, reminiscent of the paralytic in Mark chapter 2. Well, John here informs us this was the Sabbath day, and this becomes the central issue. Now, Jesus clearly anticipated the controversy, perhaps even counted on it as an opportunity to testify of himself to the unbelieving, hard-hearted, unmerciful, and hypocritical scribes and priests. But first they encounter the man who was healed. So continuing in verses 10 through 13, the Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." He answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" Then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Now the Jews of verse 10, this is John's usual way of referring to the leaders. They evidently had not witnessed the miracle or didn't recognize it when it happened. They simply see this man walking away from the pool area carrying his bed, which was probably just a mat he rolled up and tucked under his arm. But seeing this, they accuse him of breaking the Sabbath. Well, what about this question? Does their accusation have any merit? Now, it's true, no work was to be done on the Sabbath, and whoever disobeyed this was subject to execution, as the original law stated in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, and chapter 31, 12 through 17. And no burden was to be carried out of one's house or through the gates of the city on the Sabbath, as in Jeremiah 17, verses 19 through 27. But what counts as unlawful work or an unlawful burden? Any and all activity under any and all circumstances? Well, let's consider a few Old Testament examples as a kind of baseline principle. First, when Israel was in the wilderness, God was providing them food in the form of manna, bread from heaven, as it were. Now, the entire situation was unique, but God, through Moses, explicitly commanded the people to gather twice as much on the sixth day and to rest on the seventh day, gathering none. But some people stubbornly went out on the seventh day anyway, found nothing to gather, and God rebuked them. This is all recorded in Exodus 16, verses 22 through 30. Well, later on, another example in Numbers chapter 15, 32 through 36, a man is found gathering wood on the Sabbath. Now, he had 6 days every week to gather as much as he needed. But defiantly, he went about his business as usual on the Sabbath, as though it were just another day, knowing the command of the Lord and willfully disobeying it. And he was executed by stoning. When the prophet Jeremiah was sent to tell the inhabitants of Jerusalem to stop bringing their loads out of their houses and through the gates in and out on the Sabbath, what was he condemning? He was condemning business as usual, normal work, activity being done on the Sabbath as though it were just any other day. They were profaning the Sabbath. They were not treating it as holy. These are the kinds of actions and attitudes the law condemned. Now, in Jesus' day, the Jewish leaders had added both to the spirit and the letter of the law. They had attached all kinds of tedious rules and regulations, dictating to others what counted as work, even down to the most minute actions. And without regard for circumstance, although they were unwilling to hold themselves to that same rigid and merciless standard. So, returning to the man who is now walking for the first time in 38 years, his situation is anything but business as usual. And he had not disobeyed, but obeyed the explicit command of the Lord. He wasn't doing unlawful work or profaning the Sabbath. He was just leaving with his bed, as the Lord directed him. And he points this out in verse 11. He answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" In other words, he healed me, so he obviously has power and authority. What was I supposed to do? Verse 12, then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Notice how the man's testimony about being healed seems to go right past them. They don't ask, "Who healed you?" but "Who told you to carry your bed on the Sabbath?" It's like the man's claim of being miraculously healed didn't register with them, or they didn't care, being so focused on the issue as they perceived it. And I might just quickly say here, we can all act in a similar judgmental way sometimes, drawing conclusions without all the facts, and instead of carefully listening, we may filter out any information that disagrees with our conclusion. Well, even more, what the Jews are doing here is drawing conclusions not according to the law of God as it was given, but according to their traditions. And still they had no regard for the circumstances, but were closing their eyes and their ears to what had just happened to this man. So, who told you to do this? They ask. Verse 13, but the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Jesus hadn't revealed his name or stayed around very long, as if the man who was healed jumped up, spun around, only to find Jesus was no longer there. Verse 14, afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." After 38 years as a cripple, this man uses his new strength to go to the temple. Now, he wouldn't have been permitted to enter the temple in his previous condition, so for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, he goes in, no doubt praising and thanking God for his loving kindness, and wondering who was the man who healed him. His reunion with Jesus isn't happenstance. Jesus was looking and found him. He has something to tell him. And it's a sober warning. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. Now, some believe Jesus is implying the man had been injured or maimed while engaged in a sinful activity as a younger man, or that he was being punished for his sins, which would have been the common assumption at the time. But Jesus doesn't say that. What we can say is sinful activity very often does result in physical damage. But more importantly, and more to the point, sin results in spiritual damage. So however this man became paralyzed, he was a sinner, and Jesus is warning him that continuing in sin will bring worse consequences than physical ailment or even physical death. Continuing in sin will result in losing his soul, spiritual death. So we see that while Jesus compassionately healed him of his infirmity, He's most concerned with his spiritual well-being. Verses 15 and 16, the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. Some paint the man who was healed as a tattletale, who didn't reciprocate Jesus' concern for his well-being. But I prefer to give him the benefit of the doubt. Yes, he probably would have known the Jews would oppose Jesus, but he wouldn't have known the extent of their malice. And he also had every reason to believe Jesus could handle the Jews. And when he did, this would vindicate Jesus and himself for having obeyed Jesus. So it seems to me an honest and natural response to make him known. The Jews had asked him who it was. Now that he knew his name, he tells them. And there's no indication Jesus had told the man to keep it quiet. Well, John says the Jews persecuted Jesus. That is, they pursued him with malice, probably asking questions belligerently and making accusations against him. And this is the first mention in the gospel records, chronologically speaking, of the Jews' intention to kill Jesus. Now, others had tried. Herod the Great tried to kill him when he was a baby, and his fellow Nazarenes tried to throw him off the brow of the hill. But now the Jewish leaders seek his life, and for their own reasons, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. This event becomes a catalyst for their violent intentions against him. But of course, there would be others like it, adding more fuel to this fire. Well, on this occasion, all Jesus had done was spoken a few words. Words of power that enabled a man to walk, and then telling him to pick up and go. He worked a miracle. The Jews could not deny it. But to do such things on the Sabbath, they reason he cannot be from God or be working by God's power. Well, verse 17 says, "But Jesus answered them, 'My Father has been working until now, and I have been working.'" Now this is quite a statement. And in our next study, Lord willing, we'll consider what Jesus means by this, how the Jews react to it, and his further testimony about himself. Until then, thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day, and may God bless you.